You are listening to Action Design, your monthly insight into the field of behavioral economics and its applications to the world around us. We bring you leading practitioners from all industries to discuss cutting-edge behavioral research and how to practically apply those concepts to the development of consumer products and public policy.
Hello, Action Designers, and welcome to another episode of Action Design Radio. I'm your host, Zarak Khan. With me, as always, is Erik Johnson.
Hello, everyone.
And we're really excited for this episode today. So this is another in our kind of series around education and training. So this is something that has come up a lot within Action Design and just kind of more broadly, even within the behavioral science community of, hey, I'm really interested in behavioral science and I want to start doing it kind of more as like my full-time job, or I want training so that I can work it into the job I already have. Like, where do I go to get that? Folks have maybe done like workshops or like kind of like a one day or like 2 day training as part of like a conference, or the other option that they see out there is like getting a PhD, which seems like kind of daunting or time consuming. And maybe like more than what they're looking for if they're not trying to necessarily be like a researcher or something like that. So with us today to kind of talk about one of the sort of paths that is out there is Evelyn Gosnell, who is the managing director of Irrational Labs. So welcome, Evelyn.
Thank you so much for having me.
So maybe to start, could you tell us just a little bit about like your background and kind of like what Irrational Labs is, and then sort of how you ended up kind of coming up with this idea for like a more kind of intensive training or boot camp?
Okay, so Irrational Labs is a consulting firm co-founded by Dan Ariely and Kristen Berman, and we apply behavioral economics findings to product, marketing, and organizational design problems. So we work with lots of companies, and we really have three branches. One is training and workshops, and the bootcamp falls under that, and we can talk about that in more detail. The second is more direct consulting, where it's like, oh, let's help fix this problem. And then the third area is research. And a lot of times we kind of work in all three with a company, but those are the three main branches.
So did you sort of start with one area, like kind of, I'm assuming it started as like, you kind of providing your own consulting services, and then realized like, there's an opportunity to have an even greater impact by training other people, or was this kind of always part of the plan?
So that's interesting. So we basically started, you're right, in that more of the work was consulting, and, that's companies have a problem and they're like, help me fix this problem, using the science of decision making and how we make choices. But we realized that a lot of times training actually almost even helps with the consulting, because then once they understand kind of the overall behavioral principles, it's much easier to then say, oh, now we get why you're proposing this solution, and there's just greater buy-in and greater likelihood to, result in long-term change.
So did you have folks that reached out kind of at first and said like, hey, I'm at IBM or Microsoft or whatever, and I want someone to come in and train my folks on behavioral science, and then that led to a consulting engagement, or has it always kind of been the other way?
Yeah, it's almost always historically it was more of the other way. Mm-hmm. And more recently, I think with the growth, the popularity of behavioral economics, that's kind of where the demand for more training came in, and especially as, there's, as weekend executive ed programs popping up left and right, and so they're kind of wanting more of that. But a lot of our work is actually internally at companies, so either a half day or full day or even 3 day workshops within a company. So it's behavioral economics insights customized to them. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of the big difference of doing a workshop with us is it will be not just the principles, but we make you work, right? Now we say, okay, now let's figure out how this applies to us and how are we going to solve this particular product problem using these principles.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So did the boot camp then, did that kind of come out of like you had developed some material, like some training materials and some like, processes or tools that you've been using within organizations and said like, people are asking for it outside, or you kind of thought, hey, well, let's just test and see if people are interested in this externally, and kind of like take the same sort of those types of tools or whatever and turn them kind of like open it up for other just sort of like individuals to participate? Was that kind of how this bootcamp sort of came into being?
Yeah, it really came from our identification of this gap, really, that's I think pretty strongly felt in the market of lots and lots of product people who are very interested in using behavioral economics, who are kind of, drinking the Kool-Aid, ready, are bought into the concept, and they're in a product role in a company. They have no intention of just dropping everything and going to do a PhD. It's just too extreme and not part of their kind of life plan. They want to use these insights, and maybe they've done some of our attendees actually had already done one of these weekend sort of executive ed programs and found that that was great and it was fun to learn for a weekend, but it wasn't enough. They didn't have enough of the tools to bring everything back and say, I think that's where we're really kind of hitting the sweet spot, is taking behavioral economics beyond like, oh yeah, this stuff is really cool and fun, amazing, great, and say, how do you specifically apply it to the problems that you're trying to solve within your product? And I say that at the very, very beginning of the bootcamp, and we chose the word bootcamp even like consciously. I say this is not one of those things where you're going to sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight. Like, you're here to work. And so the design of the whole program is very much like lecture work, whether it's individual work or teamwork, within groups. It is very, very, very applied. And that's woven throughout the entire course, including like a final project where they run an experiment at their company, and they show the results at the end of the course.
Awesome. So given like a little bit of the background, and this is where the demand came from and how you decided to kind of, the genesis of the boot camp, if you will, tell us a little bit about the process of kind of deciding on what that content is and how you, given the limited amount of time that you have with the people in it, and also knowing what their kind of needs are and sort of the level of, expertise they need to do their jobs better. What was kind of the process like of building out that content, deciding what to include, what not to include, and, it might be interesting to dive into too, like how do you make it in that actionable format, and how do you decide on what exercises to do and things to make it a really active learning environment? Mm-hmm.
All great questions. I feel like I'm going to have to answer each one individually.
Yeah,
so in terms of the content development, it definitely has been informed by running many workshops within product teams before, and really kind of taking out what are the biggest impact principles that folks need to know, and then really taking in the other key elements of just behavioral design. So very early on in the opening weekend of the boot camp, we walk them through how to do a behavioral diagnosis, and we do a behavioral diagnosis on their product in that first weekend. So it's not just like, let's learn conceptually what other people do. It's like, no, we're sitting down, here's Post-it notes, we're going to map out the whole flow, we're going to identify the behavioral biases. So that's all. That's a big part of the course. And then, as I mentioned, the other element is experimentation. So we teach them how to do that, and then they run an experiment at their company. And then those who are willing share the results at the end. And I was delighted to see in this last cohort that we ran that people did want to share and had some really nice outcomes out of that. So that was very exciting. And then the final element is bringing in guest speakers. So Dan Early is one of our guest speakers. And then we also have Dina Rosen, who is used to be at OPower and speaks to how OPower took behavioral science. Like, how do you move from this concept of social norms and that affecting our behavior, and that's a wonderful finding, but now how do you build it into a product? And not only how do you do that, but how do you get everyone else on board? What does that look like, in terms of engineering and the marketing folks? And so she presented like frameworks and the specific, challenges that arose. So you get into the nitty gritty. We really want to move past the theoretical. So that's kind of our overarching guiding principle, I would say.
So this is the you're now in like your second iteration of the boot camp. Is that right?
Yep, second cohort.
So, have there been any kind of like changes that you made that you saw, you know, based on either feedback or just kind of from going through the process the first time that, you know, that you've kind of like iterated from there and updated things?
Yes. So the main change, I think overall from the content standpoint, no major changes there. I think that for the experiment, because of the scope of it, that it's a lot of work, we're actually going to have the teams start a little bit earlier. That's because people felt kind of crunched at the end. So I think that is one thing. We also, these are all very like kind of just almost minor details, but a logistical thing that I've learned, I have office hours available. So Kristen and I were both available for office hours. And, you know, it's just human. We know this. People are going to procrastinate. So many people waited to the end. So I'm going to be a little more directive, and we're going to nudge a little harder for people to schedule office hours with us as the course goes, because I think that's a big value add to have, you know, one-on-one time to say, yes, I know we learned this principle, but specifically here's my product flow, or here's my marketing campaign, and these are the words that I'm using, and what do you think about this? So yeah, those are two changes that I can think of off the top of my head right now that we will implement. But overall, the content, the overall structure is the same.
So on the kind of experiment side, you know, I think it's awesome that they come out with like a thing they run, analyze, you know, test and measure. Has that been a challenge at all? And like, as you've developed the course and worked with people, and that, do you run into, because, you know, I found in working with a lot of people that often like an experiment, you know, they kind of get it conceptually, they like the idea of it, but then they run into so many barriers within whatever their kind of product is, or whatever their particular organization is, where maybe they still have the resources to run the type of experiment they want, or they find out they just don't have the type of sample size they need, or not the time frame to get the sample size they need. If you run into like logistical issues or things like that with the experiment side, and do you kind of like adapt per the situation? But I'm curious to hear how you've kind of like worked through that, getting the complete exercise done.
Absolutely. All really great points. So first of all, I think one of the key lessons that we needed to impart, and I think we did successfully, is that in the beginning of the course, you're learning about all these principles, and these, you know, we show study after study, right? That's the whole point. We're showing this was the study that was done. Here's the graph of the results. And from the outside, it looks like everything went great and it's pretty. Anyone who's actually been on the research side knows that every single time you run an experiment, there's always something that goes wrong. It's not a question of whether it's going to, it's what is going to go wrong. Yep. This did not go to plan. And so we really wanted to teach people that, so that they didn't walk away with then, and like, once you start actually implementing, then you run into these challenges and you're like, oh my gosh, why is this so much harder than I thought? I give up, right? So we didn't want to set them up for quote unquote failure in that way. So we set that baseline, and then I did frame the assignment as the key thing here is to design an experiment. If we don't have time, if you don't have the sample size, if we don't have time to execute, or there's other barriers to actually getting it approved, et cetera, that's okay. You do need to present an experimental design. It's better for you, of course, if you execute it. So let's design an experiment that is an interesting and relevant business problem for you to help solve. And then I would say the majority of folks, maybe about half, did that. And then some of them, yes, they were not able to necessarily run it in that timeline, but that was fine. They still did the assignment. The exercise of thinking through, okay, what am I trying to solve? What are some principles? Like, let me map out the barriers. Why is this a problem? What are some ideas that I can use to help solve this? And basically come up with the experimental design is a worthwhile activity. And then, of course, it's bonus if you actually get the results. And it's, you know, even better. We had a few examples where the experiments worked wonderfully, statistically significant, and then boom, the company went ahead and implemented changes in their strategy based on the experiment. So that's obviously the best case scenario, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it. That just the mental process of going through experimental design is really valuable to learn, and it is very different from how we think of in a lot of different ways. So I like that that's kind of the focus and just thinking through that kind of problem. And I also like the anticipation of things going wrong. I think that's something that I think definitely myself, and I think probably a lot of people in the field have probably made. I know I've made the mistake. I think I've seen this kind of communicated away, and that we make experiments sound kind of easy. Or we're like, oh, you just got to pick two, like, hey, you can use Optimizely and it'll just do it for you. And it's like, there's so much more that goes into it. And like, until you actually start learning it, you don't realize that there's all these obstacles that you really just, to your point, need to just anticipate and know that they're going to happen and have contingency plans for, or like different options for. So I like that.
Yeah.
So thinking about, we've kind of like sort of been talking about this for a little while, I guess, but like what the experience is like for folks that are going through the boot camp. I'm wondering if you can kind of like sort of walk our listeners through sort of what they could expect if they, if they've signed up for this.
Yeah, happy to do so. So it is 2 weekends. There's an opening weekend and there's a closing weekend, and those are both in San Francisco in person. And then the rest of the 7 other sessions are online weekly, basically. But those sessions, and this is like a key detail, we get a lot of questions about this, those are live. So those are Zoom calls. We see you, you see us as we're presenting. And Zoom, I love this about Zoom. It has this wonderful feature where you press a button and you basically can put people into quote unquote rooms. So the two of you, basically, I would just assign into a room, and you guys would, we would learn a principle, and then you would work together. So we're kind of replicating as though we were together the whole time. So it's much more active learning, I guess is what I'm saying again, and applied versus sit back and just listen to someone talking at you for several hours at a time. Okay, so let's rewind back to the opening weekend. So the overall structure is very much that there's lecture time, so we learn about principles, and then we apply it. So even early on, so whatever category, let's say we're talking about attentional biases, and we're covering those, and we will give various examples of those. We'll kind of cover the research. We'll say, here's some other examples of companies, or apps. So my entire phone, if you could look at it right now, it's like full of screenshots of like every possible app, or even like photos. Like I'll walk into a Walgreens and take a picture of like, oh, that's negative social proof. Let me take a picture of that because that's going to go into my slide deck. So it's really making these principles come alive to show how other companies have been using it. And then they do an exercise often to apply it themselves. And then also in the intro weekend, we bring in the behavioral diagnosis. So, and then it goes kind of, each session we kind of go deeper, and then about midway through the course, we introduce the assignment, the kind of final assignment of the experiment, and then they start working on that as well. So it's I think it's the overall model is, kind of learning a principle, kind of lecture, and then applied, to yourself, back and forth. And that's really where I think that's hopefully the biggest value add that we bring, because it's, in 9 weeks, you get to do that. In a weekend session, it's very difficult to learn everything you need to know about behavioral economics and apply it to your own product and walk away with, concrete actionable things. And that's something that we really lean heavily towards is how do you bring this back to your team? So a couple things on that. One, we encourage from each company to have multiple team members attend. That's just historically, you're just going to be more likely to bring it back and implement things. And there's just this accountability factor there too. So that's one piece. But even if it's just one person from a company attending, even more, then we need to set that person up for success. How do they bring it back? So one of our attendees last time, literally as soon as the boot camp ended, had, I think he had a 2-hour presentation where he's like, here's everything, here's some key things that I learned at boot camp, and here's how we're going to do things differently. And he kind of got to present and like infuse the behavioral science through and bring it back to his organization, which I thought was awesome. And so we really want to set people up for success, give them the tools. We have a lot of handouts and frameworks and just a lot of content and material to help set them up with success.
So on kind of the attendees, I think you mentioned they're largely like product focused. And is that the case that they're largely more like tech product kind of audience? And, if that's the case, like how much would you think the content would change, if at all, if it was a more like outside of the product realm, let's say, like, and I guess maybe the question is like, how much do you think sort of the content, like the theory of behavioral science, and then the process of implementing it, like, does that change much depending on people's role and what they need to do with it? And how have you maybe like adapted the content according to kind of different needs of the audience? Or do you feel like it's just like sort of a systematic kind of content where it can just really work with any kind of position?
Yeah, it is absolutely a product-focused thing. I think that we could go broader and we could include policy-making type of things, but I think when you try to do too many things at once, you just don't do anything that well. So this was a strategic choice to say, we want to help enable product people to build better products in the world using behavioral science. And so all of our examples are heavily, like I said, I teach about a principle, here's the research, here's the most common, important studies you need to know, and then let's go through some examples. And then we're looking at a screenshot of Uber, and we're looking at a screenshot of, a dating app or whatever it may be. We're looking and working through real examples. And so, yeah, I think it would change, absolutely, if we were to shift it to a policy, kind of a government or NGO type of audience. It would be different. And maybe we'll do that down the line. But as far as
first
right now,
first, yeah.
the bootcamp is very product focused.
So to kind of ask a similar question, maybe a slightly different lens. So not necessarily like related to like industry, but more in terms of like role or like level or seniority within an organization. Are you finding that it's better for, you've already kind of said it's better to send more than one person. Do you want like kind of a mix of people from an organization or from a company, or is it like you want just product managers and different product managers, or do you want like, is it great for like UX leaders or even for like more executive level folks or analysts, or is it kind of like sort of targeted at sort of a sweet spot of product manager?
The ideal candidate certainly is the ideal attendee certainly is a product manager. In our last one, we also had a director of innovation. So that I think extends nicely. I think UX is also relevant. Marketing a little bit, but slightly less so. We're really interested in influencing product feature development. Obviously, behavioral science has lots of applications in marketing, but it's a little downstream. We want to affect the higher end of the product cycle.
Gotcha. Director of innovation sounds like right up my alley. I should check it out. So I guess maybe this question is kind of self-evident, but I'll ask anyways. Like, so what do these folks do afterwards? Are they always kind of going back to the organization that is it like sponsored by their company and they come in and do it? Are there individuals that are just like, hey, I want to come and like learn this and this seems like a great avenue for it, and then they are sort of off kind of doing their own thing and they just sort of take it and they have this skill set when they're like applying to their next job, or is it typically the case that it's kind of already set that someone's going to go back to their organization and perform this function there?
Yeah, that's the main goal. We did have a couple people who actively took this course as part of a career transition, kind of moving more into the behavioral science direction. But for the most part, it's sponsored by the company with the intent of bringing the insights back to the company and making concrete product changes accordingly.
So kind of going back on like the experiment note, like, obviously you train people on this process and how to like run experiments and think as a behavioral designer, if you will. How do you kind of take that approach to the course and the content itself? And that how do you kind of like go through different iterations of it and evaluate the content, evaluate the exercises you're doing, and then like iterate and try new things? Do you have kind of a formal approach to that, or is it just sort of like collect feedback from the audience, or like, I guess, like how do you view like iteration, testing, continuous improvement when it comes to a, course development and educational development perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. We did feedback both immediately after the opening weekend, because that was kind of the first big interaction that we had with the team, and then we had an overall one at the end. So overall, we had really, I'm very happy. We had great feedback overall. Like I said, I think the experiment was the main, the changes that I mentioned, moving the experiment assignment, giving it to them earlier, and having them giving them more time to digest was a result of their feedback. And even the office hours, that was even a result of people's feedback saying like, oh, I kind of realized a little bit later that I should have been doing office hours all along. So very much based on feedback. I wish that, the sample size was large enough. We actually, full disclosure, I like to run experiments on attendees if I can get away with it. So I
Absolutely.
I didn't get to do it this time, but I did it a couple years ago. I did a conference we had some grant funding, and we did a conference for companies, like HR functions, like the people who were responsible for employee wellness, right? Because that's like the trendy thing, or at least it was, a couple of years ago, especially, like companies spending millions of dollars on all kinds of wellness initiatives. And so we had the top leaders from HR from all these top companies fly in for a multiple day workshop. And dinner was included as part of this workshop. And so I had coordinated with the caterers in advance, had very complicated directions for them. They thought I was this crazy lady. I was like, okay, so don't pour. I know it's normally your job to pour the wine, but do not pour the wine. We're just going to put the wine on the table, and people are going to self-serve their wine. And then we had different wine glass sizes at half of the tables versus the other half, and then we had to calculate how much wine was consumed, average it out based on how many people were on that table. It was very complicated, but we got to show the next day, oh look, you guys who were at the tables who had the larger glasses of wine ended up consuming more wine than people who had the smaller glasses of wine. So it's a really fun thing to make them have that aha, like, oh, we just been learning about everyone else being irrational, but oh no, like maybe I am too.
I'm also
amazing.
I'm chuckling at the idea of sort of explaining these instructions and being like, oh no, I'm not crazy. It's because I'm running this experiment or blah blah blah. And halfway through, I'm like, oh wait a minute, I am crazy. But I agree. I love doing that stuff too. And whenever I can, when I'm speaking at a conference or anything like that, I'll try to incorporate some kind of experiment into the talk, because it makes it much more salient, I think, in people. Yeah, it's like, wow, I never would have thought about that. And then it makes everything else you say a little bit more, I guess, believable to some extent, but also makes it more real that it's some of these things are pretty universal.
Yeah, so we didn't do it, and for if any of the listeners end up applying, don't worry, I'm not actually running any kind of experiment on you. I did think about it. I was like, how can I design this sign up flow? I want this to split test this and have this, half the people end up here and then seeing this experience, and it got overwhelming, and I'm like, you know what, I have a boot camp to run.
Got to focus on first things first.
I didn't end up doing it, but it is really fun, and this is why I love doing this. This is what brings me joy, is those moments where you start to see people really getting it. That's why I do this. That's one of the most fun things of my job, and we even sent out when they start to recognize it, because I tell them this is great to learn, but and I show them my phone, my dorky phone with all my screenshots, and I say, this is what your phone needs to look like. You need to start going out into the world and really flexing this muscle of recognizing these principles, because that's the only way that you need to practice doing it as well. But in the meantime, you just need to be recognizing and analyzing, was this done well? Was it done? Is this a good way of doing it? Is this, ethics? That's another topic that we cover as well. All of these things are things you need to be recognizing and thinking about and asking yourself, and would you do it that way? Would you do it differently? So I remember we sent out an email. We, did the research for these are the hotels that are nearby to the site, and we basically sent an email. These are the 3 closest hotels, and we made some sort of note on Hilton, by the way, they're having a special. It only goes till this day. And then one of the attendees immediately responded back. She's like, "Oh, great! I can see you're like making a recommendation, and there's a deadline for this one. It's working on me. I'm going to sign up already for the Hilton." So that's cheesy, but it's just to say that they start to see it quickly themselves, and that brings me joy.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And I'm tempted to spend the rest of the podcast brainstorming experiments that we can on unsuspecting attendees. We'll stay on topic, I guess.
They definitely, like, when it comes to the food, they are very on guard, and they're like, "What are you doing?" Like, I'm really not. I wish I had something on my sleeve right now, but
it's actually funny too, because I remember when I first was really doing a lot of this stuff, and I would tell people I'm in behavioral science or whatever that is. For a long time, and I feel like it's slowed down lately, when people would ask "Oh, so are you analyzing me right now?" And partially I'm like, well, kind of, but not maybe in the way you're thinking of. But people always have their guard up a little bit around behavioral scientists, I suppose.
Yes, I can relate to that for sure.
So one question I had is we were kind of talking about sort of the outcomes and what people do when they go back. Have you gotten any interesting case studies after the fact of people that took the workshop and then came back later and said hey, here's what we've done. Here's this cool experiment we end up running, or have you been able to collect much kind of longer term change, or heard more from attendees on how they've really changed their workflow?
Yes. We had an attendee from Livongo, and he's the example that I gave earlier around number one. I think he's done more than one product session kind of takeaway, here's the takeaways from the boot camp. And by the way, I tell the attendees, as an aside, there's nothing that crystallizes your learning more than having to represent it to, that's what's going to help you. Yeah. You should just do it selfishly for you, really. So he's done 2 sessions around that, and continued to run several experiments to improve his product and the adoption rate of the product. So that's probably one of the best examples that we have. And I think there's a few others. I need to kind of follow up and bunk them. We've had a few attendees kind of write up blog posts and say, here are the next things that I've done. Oh, one of our attendees also, I love this. She created a behavioral economics reading book club.
Excellent.
So, yeah.
Very cool. So, I'm kind of curious as to, we've talked a little bit about the changes between sort of the first iteration and this current one. Where do you see this going down the road? And we talked a little bit about expanding to policy folks or content changes, that sort of that I don't know if that's necessarily on your roadmap or not. Are you kind of thinking this sort of steady state for now and sort of seeing how it goes, or how do you see it changing over time?
Yeah, so I can actually answer in a weird way and say that one thing that I know we will likely not do, that we get asked for a lot, and we will likely not, even though it would be very easy, we will likely not just take this content, record all of it, put it all online. It would just, life would be easier for us if we just did that, right? You do all of the work once and it's just out there in the world. I don't think we'll do that for several reasons. One, you just don't learn. We know enough about how people learn, and there's just a huge difference between this passive and active learning. I don't want to just create a course where someone can sit there and multitask doing other things, and they're not taking the insights in the same way if they're not practicing. And it's not just about the practice, but it's really the benefit of having folks like Kristen Berman, myself, some of our other behavioral scientists actually walk you through and say, yeah, you got that almost, here's the parts that are right about that, but did you think about X, Y, and Z thing as well? So you miss all of that. So I think and then second, our Behavioral Economics Bootcamp does not admit everyone, right? It's an application process, and we are looking to help people who are solving for good. So for the first round, we rejected a lot of the applicants because we're not in the business of just selling more tchotchkes. That's not what we're here to do. So I think that model of just putting your content out into the world, universally, I don't think we're really aligned with that. So that's something that we get asked for a lot. They're like, well, I'm not based in San Francisco. Flying there twice just seems like a lot. And unfortunately, right now, I just don't intend on doing a kind of online only model. One thing that I am considering is we don't know yet, but there seems to be some demand from the European market. We were actually just in our whole team was in South Africa last week, presented to financial service providers, kind of fintech companies, and same thing. They were like, "Oh, this bootcamp is great, but wow, South Africa, San Francisco is really far from all of the African continent. But if we did one in London or Paris or Berlin, that is much more doable." So I think we would need to confirm that there was sufficient demand. But in the long run, we could expand this model to have a European version as well.
Go on the Irrational Labs world tour.
We'll see. I'm not
selling out stadiums and stuff. Yeah.
I'm not committing to it yet. It's way more work, so it's a little daunting. But if there was really clear demand, we might do one version. I don't know. We'll see. But that's kind of where my head is right now.
No, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just gonna say I like that answer. I've been thinking a lot lately about how to sort of be conscientious about scaling things, and so I like that you're kind of thinking through that already, and not immediately just sort of thinking, oh well, record and put it up online or whatever. Because I totally agree. I think that you lose a lot when you do that. And
I mean, it's kind of the opposite of what a good business people with it. Passive income, right?
Right.
This is the opposite of what a good quote unquote just pure business decision, which is just the more it requires more of our work versus just we've done it once and just operationalize it, scale it. But that's not what we're here to do. So
yeah, no, it's I mean, I agree. I think it's funny to frame it as a good business decision or not, because that's kind of how I've been thinking about things too. Of well, okay, is it a good business decision to scale something? Well, I mean, I guess if you don't know anything else about the product or whatever, and you're should you scale it or not? Sure, scale it. But if the flip side is that, well, you're now providing a significantly less valuable thing to people, either the cost of it sort of reflects that, or you're just kind of say no, we hold ourselves to a standard where we want to make sure that the thing we're providing has a lot of value, and we think this is the most valuable way of doing it, and so we're kind of sticking with that. So, yeah, no, I just really like that answer.
Thanks. I like it too.
Yeah.
We like our own ideas. It's amazing.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
So we're getting towards the end of our time here. So, one thing we usually tend to ask, I think we put kind of a twist on it for the education aspect is, often we kind of ask people that are guests, you're in this behavioral field, what would you recommend if somebody's listening to this and they're just really interested in the behavioral science realm and are kind of trying to figure out what it is they want to do? What would you recommend that they take as next steps, or, how should they sort of figure that out? And I think we even think of this from an education standpoint, and that, how would you think about if somebody is kind of interested in exploring behavioral science more and maybe finding some kind of role, whether that's doing it as a kind of full-time position or as part of their own, what's a good process for kind of going about and finding the right courses like yours, the right resources to sort of dip their toes in the water and find what they like and what they're good at and where they can provide value?
So I'm going to split this answer. I think that there's a really big difference between the folks who are in the bucket of, wow, behavioral science is cool, and it's almost has entertainment value to them, and there's no judgment for me. I think we're also fall into that, right? Where it's fun, and I think there's so much out there. If you want to be, again, I don't want to call it passive, but kind of the easier starting point, there's just so many podcasts, right? To be like yours, listen to this, listen to the things that are out there. There's so many free resources. We all commute, we all take plane rides. Listen to podcasts when you be efficient. And not just efficiency, it's just probably you're making your commute more enjoyable, right? You're increasing your happiness by listening to a podcast and learning something new along the way. I do think that there's a different bucket than if you're looking to apply it, take it more career steps in this direction, then that's not enough to be listening to the podcasts and reading the books. Then it's much more about what I was talking about earlier about flexing this muscle, learning yourself, recognizing it, taking pictures, thinking about how would you're really putting yourselves into that person's shoes, the person who made that decision, right? Like the product manager or the marketer. Would you do it that way? Would you do it differently? Start some of the more junior folks that I work with. I'm like, what are you waiting for? You should be taking screenshots. Do a blog post. Blogs are free. You should be writing, not just, again, taking the pictures, but like the act of writing forces us to consolidate our thoughts on something, right? It's a really good exercise for us to do. So start writing a blog post, run experiments. Run experiments in your own personal life. Run experiments. Let's not talk about, I have a very embarrassing dating experiment that I ran years ago to the point where now no one probably trusts me. If you like Google me and find it, like I'm going to wonder, oh my gosh, is this woman running an experiment on me, or is this a real date? They're probably, because I did that. Because that's what you had to, I just was curious and saying I need to practice running experiments. And so, I think if you're in the bucket of taking this seriously and wanting to make something in terms of a career of it, you need to go beyond all the free resources and just reading about it and learning and again, quote unquote, flex the muscle.
Yeah, that's great advice. I can speak to that. Like, things like blog posts and stuff like that are so valuable, and like you said, like running your own experiments, like there's nothing to stop you. Like the thing that kind of got me so interested in this in the first place is that it kind of applies to everything. So there's no reason once you learn stuff, you can't start applying it to any aspect of your life in whatever way is applicable. And the blog post is a really good idea too. I know when I was early on and was getting really into this stuff and I was doing all the reading and things like that, I started like a little blog and started distilling some of my insights, and I'm sure nobody read it. Like, I don't think there was any real traffic to it. But when I was reaching out to people and trying to get, into the field, and I would send that, and it showed like some level of interest and competence, and that I was able to at least like communicate take some time to write out my thoughts and actually be able to communicate it. And, I'd probably be embarrassed by it now, but at the time, probably good enough for
I'm totally on board. I'm super embarrassed with my early stuff, and hopefully, I should go find a way to like take that stuff down from the internet because it was out there. But I do think, not just about how many views who cares about any of that? It doesn't even have to be a blog. Like, you could just write it for yourself. The blog is nice because it adds some like accountability, right? To not write completely stupid stuff. Like, you want to think through your arguments and write it well. But what I'm saying is that the value is in thinking through the arguments. The act of writing forces us to clarify our thoughts, to make them make sense. And that's what I'm talking about. That's the value of this.
Definitely. And you can flip it back to your course and making it applicable, having people think through an experimental design, things like that. Like, that's what kind of drives it home and actually, makes it real to people.
So all that being said, are we going to find out what this dating experiment was?
Oh my gosh. I'm literally going to go after this and like find it and take it down, but I will tell you guys just for fun.
Okay.
So I wanted to make a larger point around the fact that in general in the product space, there's an over-reliance on customer feedback, right? Like, and that's, in some ways, it's a good thing. We shouldn't just be doing things in a silo and just, our intuition is that blah, blah, blah is going to work. And so customer feedback is good, but there's an over-reliance on like, let's do surveys and let's do focus groups and let's ask customers let's ask them to predict how they would behave, right? So we know all of the flaws of this, but yet companies don't fully realize this. And so how do you write a post on this in a way that's interesting? Well, use dating because it's more interesting and appealing to people. So I took in my experience, men basically would say that, I don't like when women wear makeup. I prefer the natural look, blah, blah, blah. And in my head, I'm like, that's hilarious.
Yeah, right.
That's hilarious because that is not my lived experience, right? I am treated differently wearing makeup versus not. Now, if you analyze this for a second, there could be a confound here, which is that I'm more likely to be wearing, like not wearing, if you think about the places I don't wear makeup, it would be like, I'm at the grocery store. If I'm at a bar, I'm more likely to be wearing makeup. So maybe that's confound. So now we have to run an experiment, right? So anyway, so I started with just doing a survey and asking men, do you like makeup, no makeup? Sure enough, I confirmed that they said that they preferred the no makeup look. And then this was a number of years ago when people still used OkCupid, and I set up 2 profiles and I made them exactly the same. And I had to make it like really boring and kind of sounding, because I didn't want anything on the profile to really stand out, to be memorable for the guy to realize like, oh, I saw this one before. So I had, because I ran them at the same time. They were live at the exact same time. And I had the same outfit, and I took 2 pictures, one with makeup and one without. And I got many more messages in the version with makeup. So bottom line is, do not ask customers what they want. Run an experiment instead.
I love this experiment.
That's a great experiment. A/B testing dating profiles is one of my favorite things that's ever happened on this podcast, I think. That's amazing.
Absolutely embarrassing.
But no, I mean, that is like a really great point. It's just like, what do people say their intentions are? Like, just you don't know until you test it. All the surveys and market research in the world won't tell you what an experiment will.
Yes, because it's influenced by how we want to think of ourselves. Men want to think of themselves as being like, no, I don't, I like the natural look. You sound like a better person if you say that, right? So that's what they say.
Our aspirational selves are much better people in general.
Right. The funniest thing was I don't remember if it was like 1 or 2 who did identify. They're like, wait, aren't there? I think I saw another profile of you.
Wow, very astute observers.
So thank you very much for telling that story. That was amazing. We are kind of just at the end of our time here. So I guess like 2 kind of closing questions or things. One is just like, how can people kind of stay in touch either with you or learn more about the boot camp? And then also I've been enjoying asking the folks this question of just like what they've been reading or like kind of watching lately that they liked and would recommend to folks. Eric and I kind of just did this the other day, so I don't know that we have anything new other than I did get the alchemy book, Eric, after you recommended it. So just arrived yesterday. But how can folks kind of learn more, stay in touch, and then any kind of things that you're reading or watching these days that you think, or listening to, that you think people should check out or that you liked?
Yes. So for the bootcamp, it's behavioraleconomicsbootcamp.com. That's very easy. And Irrational Labs, we are on Twitter, Irrational Labs. I'm on Twitter, Evelyn Gosnell. In terms of stuff that I would actually, am I allowed to say another podcast?
You certainly are. The behavioral science podcast realm is not a zero-sum game, so we're happy to support.
Right. Not a behavioral science one. Okay. Well, it's not directly. So, Center for Humane Tech. If you've heard of Tristan Harris, he's doing some really good work in thinking about how do we think about the attention economy? How do we address this big problem of the incentive misalignment? How do we design better products? So he has a new podcast out. The first 2 episodes talk about, there's an anthropologist who talks about gambling and how basically behavioral science insights were used to make gambling as addictive as it is, and kind of using that as a metaphor for apps now, and how we're entering a dangerous space where we're designing apps that are not aligned with people's long-term best interests, and how do we fix this? And it's a big problem. So, listening to one podcast isn't going to fix it, but will it help trigger some thoughts and move the needle in the right direction in the long run? Yeah. So I think that's what I would recommend.
Awesome.
That's a great suggestion. I'm familiar with their work. I didn't know they had a podcast, so I'm going to add that to my queue as well.
There you go.
Thank you very much. I'll do one little plug for Action Design. We just launched a jobs board that I forgot to mention last time, but so we did this in partnership with People Science, and basically it's a behavioral science jobs board for folks who have gone through trainings or education or are looking for jobs in behavioral science. I would recommend checking that out. Otherwise, Evelyn, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing all these great stories and for all the great advice.
Thanks. I didn't anticipate mortifying myself, but
I found that
let's keep life a little fun.
It's always helpful to anticipate mortifying yourself, is what I've found to be.
Just like we talk about experiments are going to go wrong, like at some point we're going to wildly embarrass ourselves too. So.
Well, yeah. So thanks very much, and yeah, we'll talk to you all next time.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening. That concludes this edition of Action Design Radio, hosted by Eric Johnson and Zarak Khan. All podcast episodes are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and many other platforms where you might typically get your pod on. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Special thanks to Morgan Bortz for design, and as always, we would like to recognize Steve Wendell, founder of the Action Design Network, a nonprofit organization dedicated to spreading awareness about behavioral economics, psychology, and all things behavioral science in order to help you improve your life, your career, and your understanding of the world around us and the people in it. I am your producer and audio engineer, Zach Simon. For more cutting-edge behavioral science content, visit action-design.org. Once again, that's action-design.org. There, you can sign up for our newsletter and find an in-person event happening near you. We have chapters in over a dozen cities in the United States and Canada. Also, on our website, you can find additional notes and links regarding the topics discussed in today's episode. Thank you again for tuning in, and we will see you again soon.